Bill Botel is one of Australia's most highly respected, if not eminent, health advisors. He's now a strategic consultant specialising in health policy and the application of new technologies to social marketing. In Bill's previous life, he was the chief political advisor to former Prime Minister Paul Keating. He was also the senior advisor to the Australian Health Minister, overseeing the implementation of the Medicare scheme and the development response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. Bill is also an accomplished author, having written numerous books including Unmasked: The Politics of Pandemics, and it's because of Bill's expertise he understands acutely what is required to manage pandemics. Bill is regularly sought by media and government, and Bill Botel joins us today to examine the lockdowns, the Delta variant, and why the Prime Minister's 80% vaccination threshold is unachievable. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Good to be here.
Now, where are we today? We're 18 months in. Where do you see the flaws in our response?
Well, until about mid-June, we were on a slow and steady way to improve the situation. We had COVID zero in Australia from October last year. But disastrously, in the middle of June, finally the Delta variant got through our very poor hotel quarantine arrangements, and particularly at Sydney Airport. And since the middle of June, the situation has worsened dramatically. New South Wales is beginning to drag down the whole country because of its very poor response to the emergence of Delta. They want to have this so-called living with COVID Delta. But the trouble is that we're trying to do that in a country that is still largely unvaccinated. It certainly was in mid-June, and it's only getting a bit better now. And this is creating havoc and mayhem in Sydney, not least of which for the over 30 people who have lost their lives because of the inadequate response of the New South Wales government. Of course, businesses are being smashed in particularly Western, Southwestern Sydney. The schools are in chaos. The hospitals are being filled up in their ICU wards and so on with people with COVID. And there is no way out of it under the present settings of the New South Wales government. And we're seeing today that we've had a case now emerge in the ACT, which has been free of COVID for over a year, I think, and in the Western areas of New South Wales bordering on the Indigenous communities. So this is a really serious national crisis brought on by the government of New South Wales and the intransigent refusal of the Premier of New South Wales to change course while there's still time.
Do you think the patchwork approach with different states and territories going their own way instead of a national consolidated approach is problematic?
Well, what we've seen in the last year and a half is when the federal government a year and a half ago, for a few weeks and months, somehow decided that we would have to learn to live with COVID, to let it in and let it run, like in the United Kingdom. That's really what provoked the states and territories at that time, I think, to respect and understand the will of the people, that they would rather live without COVID until we had something come along, vaccinations or cures or treatments or whatever. So when the federal government was wrong, the states and territories proved to be right. They went for COVID zero. Now we saw in Melbourne, there was a terrible wave of infection that took 15 weeks or so until it could be clobbered in October. But from October last year till mid-June, thanks to the states and territories, and there was a unified purpose. I mean, eventually everybody came to understand that the economy went better with zero COVID in the community, and of course it's better for health and the people who didn't lose their lives and so on. So we got to an okay stage by the middle of June, and now it's been deeply undermined by trying to do something that's impossible. That is, live with COVID Delta, which is so much more infectious and difficult than the coronavirus COVID we had to deal with last year. Now, the only way we can deal with this is to vaccinate everybody. So everybody who's watching this owes it to themselves and their family and their community to go and get vaccinated today. Don't put it off. But even then, when you're vaccinated at 70 or 80%, we still will now have a very tricky way out of all of this to do our best to keep cases and deaths and disruption at the lowest possible levels. I wish we were in a better position. I wish there were a magic wand and we could say, well, it'll all be over by some mythical freedom day, but that just ain't going to happen. I wish it could. But if you believe in that, I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you, and we can go and have a talk with Santa Claus. It ain't going to happen in the way that people would like it to happen. We've got to be realistic about this. We've got to get vaccinated. We've got to strengthen our public health systems. We've got to do much better at the quarantine. And we've got to take it, slowly and surely to get ourselves out of what is now a real mess.
So if you were advising Scott Morrison, what would be the steps that you would advise him now, Bill? Where do we go through?
I would say get on the phone to the Premier of New South Wales and on behalf of the premiers and chief ministers and the people of Australia and the people of New South Wales say, you have got to bring COVID Delta under control in Sydney. They say there's no guidebook or playbook, but this is not so. We've seen in the last few months in Adelaide and South Australia, in Brisbane and in Victoria, they are applying the guidebook that works, short, sharp lockdowns or effective lockdowns to stop movement because the virus can only move with people. Now, Sydney is a big area, I accept that, but we know that the key to stopping people moving, particularly in Western, Southwestern Sydney, the gig economy and the casual workers, they have to have money. Money is the greatest vaccine of all, right at the moment. So they've got to be given the financial support to stay at home, whatever they're going, tradies or drivers or cleaners or all of that casual and gig economy workforce have got to be paid to stay at home. And however much it costs, it's trivial to the benefits we will all get by bringing Delta under control in Sydney and have it on the downhill run rather than, as we've seen today, 345 new cases, same as yesterday, no plan to contain it in Sydney or even within New South Wales. Now, this is not good enough. This is just not acceptable, in my view, to the people of New South Wales. And of course, it's a terrible tragedy for those people who are losing their lives, or the 60 or 70 people today who are in intensive care units. Being in intensive care with COVID is no fun. You're in there for days and weeks, and some people have to be ventilated with a tube in the hope that they can save their lives. So I don't think anybody in New South Wales wants this as the future, as the indefinite future. There's no freedoms at the end of this. The freedoms we had were the freedoms we had in the middle of June. You could travel around Australia, you go to the theatre, you go to the footy, you could see your friends and families, you could go to weddings and funerals and all that sort of stuff. They've gone. Now, I think we want them back, and we're going to get it back by not doing what New South Wales is doing today.
Yeah, the narrative or the false dichotomy of economy or health, rather than it's not an either or, it's an and. How do we break that? Has the messaging from the government contributed to this? Because they seem to separate the two.
They do. I think you're right. And of course, anybody who's been around in Australia for the last year knows that if you had a small business, or big business for that matter, or you wanted to go on holiday or go to the snow or go to the North Queensland, the economy did pretty well under zero COVID. Zero COVID doesn't mean eradicating COVID from the face of the earth. That's impossible. But it means that by running an elimination strategy, every time it showed its head, you could clobber it. And we had a very good period, and the economy went very well. You could see it. It recovered extremely quickly from the recession of a year ago, caused by the initial response in the lockdown. So it wasn't perfect, but at least it was going ahead in the right direction, and people could plan for the future. Businesses could stock up and staff up and look forward to a pretty good year. And all of that's fallen into a heap because of the actions of the government of New South Wales. So if I was Scott Morrison, I'm sure he's concerned. He's concerned for the economy and concerned for the health of the Australian people on both counts. That's not being looked after by the government of New South Wales today. So we've got to do something radically different in New South Wales if we're to get back to a healthy economy and a healthy country.
The divisive nature of the rhetoric around this, has the government lost that much trust now that it's going to be difficult to get it back and get us all moving in the same direction and accepting what actually needs to be done to advance this?
Well, you're right about trust. I mean, the core of this is trust, and that's built by being transparent, by being humble. Both the federal government and the New South Wales government have got a lot to be humble about. They delayed federally about the vaccines, which we've seen has had terrible consequences. That was 6 months behind where it ought to have been. And they did nothing to upgrade the quarantine against Delta. We know that this Howard Springs facility in the Northern Territory is very good because it's separate cabins. They're not connected by common ventilation systems and air conditioning as the hotels are. They're separate cabins. And so far, hopefully, into the future, we haven't had a Delta transmission out of the Howard Springs facilities. So they're pretty simple to build. And I think if they'd been built a year ago or 6 months ago, and they had become the standard quarantine arrangements around our major cities, then it would have been very unlikely that we would have had the outbreaks of Delta that we had. And of course, went through Sydney Airport, where under the health orders in mid-June, that limo driver, he wasn't required to be vaccinated. I don't think he was even required to wear proper PPE. And of course, the incoming crew were not necessarily required to be vaccinated as well. So if you don't vaccinate, you don't organise the quarantine arrangements and you just hope for the best but never plan for the worst, you get to where we are in Sydney today.
Yeah. Is it a bit of smoke and mirrors, a bit of distraction by the government, blaming hesitancy and failure to comply with the health orders rather than actually their own loopholes and their own failures in...
Correct.
Yeah.
So, correct. I mean, the blaming becomes pretty shameless. Everybody else is responsible except the person in the mirror. Now, things have gone pretty wrong. I mean, nobody could say that 350 cases a day and deaths every day in Sydney is a great triumph of organisation and public policy, particularly when we knew what to do to stop it. So blaming everybody else but not accepting responsibility is a pretty poor look. Now, the governments have got to be humble, they've got to apologise, they've got to accept they created the problem, and the people, I think, demand that they fix it, and we know what works to fix it. The Premier of Western Australia has been very critical of the Premier of New South Wales because he knows what to do. And today, where would you rather be opening your small business? In Perth or Sydney? Well, you can't open your small business in Sydney because Delta's running rampant, but you can in Perth. Or you can go to the football, or you can go to the theatre. The hospitals aren't full in their ICUs of people with COVID. So where's the economy working better? In Perth. And of course, where is it without COVID? In Perth. So do what they do in Perth. Let's do that in Sydney. That's the guidebook. It's not hidden away. It's not kept secretly. Many communities in Australia, many premiers live under arrangements that so far have done very well to keep Delta at bay, with one exception. and that's in New South Wales and in Sydney.
All right, Bill, thanks very much for your time and your clear and concise, if not somewhat frustrating, take on the whole thing. It's...
I wish we could be happier, but let's just be realistic and get on top of it.
Great.
And vaccinate.
Great. Thanks so much for your time today, Bill.
Okay, thank you. Bye.